Have you believed the lie that you have to shoot at ISO 100 for the best landscape photography? Well, in this video, I'll reveal the truth that landscape photography pros know about ISO and how you can use it to take better photos the next time you grab your camera. First, let's settle the debate. Is it ISO or ISO? Well, actually, the people who created ISO invented a new word, ISO, so that you wouldn't have to use the three letters ISO to define what you're talking about, but I use both interchangeably, and you can use both too to define ISO or ISO, whichever you prefer to use. If you think about the three things you use to balance the light in your exposure, your shutter, your aperture, and your ISO, the shutter and aperture stand alone on their own because they're allowing light to enter into your camera and hit the sensor in different ways. The ISO is basically like a volume knob that you turn up on your sensor. Now, you can raise this knob to either go brighter or darker for your camera to take a brighter or darker photo. Now, when I'm talking about raising your ISO, the first thing naysayers are going to say is that ISO and raising an ISO actually creates image noise. But the truth is that noise is actually already there, even in low ISO photos. All raising an ISO is doing is impact the electric sensitivity to that noise that's already existing in your photos. So with that understood, you may be thinking, why don't I just take photos at ISO 100 like everybody tells me to and just raise the exposure in post-processing? Let me show you why you shouldn't do that. On my screen here, you see 4 photos shot of the exact same subject in the exact same light. Now, if you look at all these photos, you can see that 3 of them look pretty much the same and 1 looks darker. The one darker photo was the photo that was shot at ISO 100, but I want to put this to the test and see if what I'm saying is actually true. So this photo here was shot with an ISO 100, but you see it's making it really dark. If I raise the exposure to match the others, and go back to our library here and see what that looks like, it's pretty much the same now. However, with an ISO of 100 and bringing in image noise, you can see that it really impacts the image noise a lot more in this photo than the others that I shot with just a high ISO. Let's go to the next photo here and see what that looks like. This photo here was shot with an ISO of 500, and I just wanted to test these out. You can see a little bit of noise here, but you can see that it's much less noisy than the one shot at ISO 100. Now, I did want to put this to the extreme test. So the next 2 are shot at extremely high ISOs to test this properly. So this one here was shot at an ISO of 3200. We can still see that there is some image noise there, but it's still not that much that differs from the ISO 100 that we shot at and just raised that exposure up. The next photo we'll look at was shot at a whopping ISO of 16,000. Let's zoom in on it. There is a lot of image noise here, but honestly, it's really not that different from the ISO 100 that we raised the exposure on. Look, ISO 100 is great to use when you're not starving your camera for light, like if you're shooting in a bright daylight photo, or if you're shooting some long exposures of some waterfalls and you have a longer exposure and shutter speed to blur out that movement of the water. But you shouldn't starve a camera for light just to use ISO 100. Remember, I would much rather have a photo with a little bit of noise in it rather than not getting the photo I want because I refuse to get out of shooting ISO 100. In just a second, I'm going to show you 4 tips to remember when you're using ISO. But first, I want to tell you about Landscape Photography Plus, a platform where you can get multiple landscape photography courses for under $11 and you're guaranteed 1 course per month. That is linked below in the video description, or you can go to landscapephotographyuniversity.com. Tip number 1 for ISO is that you can actually use higher ISOs to help you freeze action. This is really beneficial when you're shooting wildlife photography or you're adding animals or fast-moving action into your landscape photography. When you're using higher ISOs, it allows you to shorten your exposure speed and get tack-sharp movement within your photos, which is fantastic when you're photographing animals or including wildlife into a landscape. Because that ISO is more sensitive to light, you can increase that shutter speed and take a faster shutter speed and freeze that action. Tip number 2 is a big no-no with ISO when you kind of covered it a little bit when we were comparing the ISO on my computer screen, and that is you should never take a photo at ISO 100 with the intent to raise the ISO in post-processing. That actually reveals more image noise in a photo where you could just take it at a higher ISO and you would actually see less image noise in that higher ISO photo. You should also never crop a higher ISO photo too much. You should always take the composition in the field, trying to fill as much of the frame as possible, getting the right shot in camera. Now you can crop a little bit, but more cropping actually reveals more of that image noise. So just be mindful of that composition when you're actually taking photos in the field. Here's a great tip too. Shoot in auto ISO when you're using manual shutter speed and aperture. Allowing your camera to balance the ISO is a great way to use it because your camera will use that ISO to be the peacekeeper between your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO, and allow you to balance that exposure. Plus, it relieves a lot of the pressure because you're worrying about one less thing than you were in the field just having it set on auto. I do this all the time when I'm out shooting landscapes, and it comes in handy, and it's a really great feature to use because I'm only worried about my shutter and aperture, and then I trust my camera to balance that ISO for me. Now, if you want another video that's going to help you balance your exposure even more in your camera, you can click or tap this video showing up on your screen right now that's going to show you exactly how to do that.